Hello, everyone, and welcome to InnovaHealth Partners webinar series. I'm Tim Berkowitz, managing partner and founder of InnovaHealth Partners, and I'm here with Toby Cosgrove, our senior partner. InnovaHealth, as you know, is the leading growth investor in the medical technology sector. Thank you very much for joining us today as we welcome for the second time Dr. Robert Califf, former FDA commissioner. Robert, we last talked to you 4 years ago, and a lot has changed. This webinar is being pre-recorded, but feel free to add questions in the chat box on your screen, and we will follow up with answers promptly. Toby and I are delighted to host Robert Califf. Robert, thanks for joining us for this conversation today. Toby, can I turn it over to you to introduce Robert?
Absolutely, Rob. We're delighted to have you. Thanks for joining us for the second time. You are a renowned cardiologist with a long career and nationally recognized expert in cardiovascular medicine, clinical research, health outcomes research, healthcare quality, and a leader in translational research. You served as commissioner of U.S. Food and Drug Administration twice, from 2016 to 2017, and again in 22 to 25, where you work to ensure drugs, vaccines, medical devices, cosmetics, food supply, and dairy supplements are safe and effective. Prior to his second tenure at the FDA, he was head of medical strategy and a senior advisor for Alphabet, where he contributed to its health subsidiaries, Verily Life Science and Google Health. Rob is unbelievably written, more than 1,200 peer-reviewed publications, one of the most frequently cited authors in biomedical science. Rob, we're delighted to have you, and thank you very much. Let me just start out with a little bit about your accomplishments at the FDA. What's your proudest accomplishment during your time at the FDA?
I tend to think about accomplishments less about specific activities and more about the impact you have on people. So I think a lot of people have come through the FDA during my tenure who I hope are better at what they do because of the systematic approach that we took to regulation and also stimulation of innovation and thinking about risk and benefit overall. So, Toby, I don't really point to us one individual component. It's more the people. And of course, I'm sure we'll get into it, but one of the saddest sort of corollaries to that is that many of the people I thought were the best at what they did are no longer there because of the changes that have happened. But we can talk about that later.
What was your most difficult crisis during the periods you were commissioner?
Well, there were plenty of those. And one of the, I think any former FDA commissioner will tell you that one of the really fascinating things about the job is you come in every day expecting that something will happen in an area where you have no expertise, that will require sorting through the problem and helping people who do have expertise solve the problem. Out of all the things that happened, probably the most difficult was the infant formula crisis. And it was, I don't know why this happened, but it was the day I was confirmed that the decision had been made at the FDA to essentially close the Abbott plant that was making a very significant proportion of all the infant formula for the country. And so day one, back on the job, we were in the middle of a threatened shortage of formula for children, which is something obviously they can't do without. And all sorts of politics and issues came into play as we worked through that and eventually got to the point where we had a stable supply. But just learning about what you could do in terms of using the military to fly in formula from other countries is one example. I also got a lot of experience with consent decrees, which there's no reason any normal person should have to think about that. But in the circumstances, we essentially had to take Abbott to court and essentially become partners in management of the situation with Abbott, with us having the final say, which is what a consent decree is. Um, but we eventually got to smooth sailing, but not without a lot of bruises and things that were really scary along the way.
Let's look at the other side of it. What do you regret not having accomplished?
Probably the number one thing for me was that we had a pair of things related to tobacco. Remember that it's sort of a neck and neck battle between hypertension and combustible tobacco for the leading cause of remediable death in the US. Of course, now with cardiometabolic disease rapidly catching up, still 30 million people using combustible tobacco in the US, and still aggressive marketing techniques with menthol um, tobacco aimed at African Americans. Um, and we also had a history going all the way back to my first tenure. Remembering what the law says is that FDA regulates tobacco and can regulate what's in tobacco, but it cannot take the nicotine level down to zero. But a lot of science has been done to show that there is a level of nicotine that can be in the tobacco leaf that doesn't cause addiction. And a big part of this history, of course, is that the tobacco industry aggressively used old-fashioned genetics to breed tobacco that optimized the amount of nicotine and the delivery of nicotine to the brain to get as many people addicted as possible. Basically using breeding of plants, the old Mendelian approach. Now, of course, you could do it with gene editing. And so reversing that is actually something that can be done. So in the case of menthol tobacco, we took that through the executive branch, and the White House decided not to go forward with it, frankly, for political reasons. And we also put forth a rule that would limit the nicotine level to a subaddictive level. And that got through as a proposed rule, but the machinery was so difficult politically that there wasn't, we needed to put that proposed rule through a year earlier to get the final rule done. So neither one got finished. And in the meanwhile, we still are seeing very significant death and disability from combustible tobacco. So that to me is number one on the list. It's and I think these issues will come back up again. They're not over, which is another thing about the FDA. The underlying issues never really go away. They may not get solved the first time around, but they keep coming back.
Let's talk a little bit about the the COVID vaccine, et cetera. And how did you feel the FDA responded to the misinformation about the vaccine, and what lessons can be learned from that?
Well, I think we have to view the FDA as one part of a much larger issue. And just to clarify, when I came back to the FDA, it was February of 2022. It was in the middle of the Omicron wave, so warp speed had already happened. I had nothing to do with that, but I think it's fair to say, as many people are saying now, it's one of the most amazing scientific achievements in the history of mankind that vaccine was put together so quickly and was so highly effective. In fact, I'm writing some articles now. There's a slew of articles about the update that happened last year in the vaccine, where unfortunately both healthcare providers and the general public did not avail themselves of the vaccine at the rates that were hoped for. But the data show, just like all the other updated boosters, about a 40 to 50% reduction in death and hospitalization for those who got it compared to those who didn't. And of course, at the core of the lack of uptake is what I think has been a very deliberate campaign of misinformation about vaccines in general and specifically about the COVID vaccine. And so you ask the question, what can the FDA do about that? And it's an interesting topic that I think will be discussed a lot in law classes and public health classes in the future. But, the FDA approves or gives authorization for marketing vaccines, but it doesn't have responsibility for the public health application delivery of the vaccines. That's the CDC. And FDA tried to be a bit aggressive about its role in this regard, but we actually lost cases in court. And the particular one that was interesting was not about the vaccines, but about ivermectin. Remember, as Toby, as you pointed out, I had the 5 years in between my stints at FDA where I was advising Alphabet or Google. And I learned a lot about advertising in that to see, I really wanted to understand how it worked because it seemed so important. So just before I came back to FDA, Janet Woodcock and the team decided to run a tweet that said, "Don't be a horse, don't be a cow, don't use ivermectin for COVID," which was totally consistent with the data, which showed no benefit of ivermectin and the risks that they were concerned about, and I was too when I came in. People who were consuming animal doses of ivermectin, sometimes causing significant harm. So no benefit and significant harm seems straightforward to me. The tweet went viral, so it's probably the most effective communication that the FDA had, but the courts actually sided with a group of doctors that took us to court and said we were infringing on the practice of medicine. And the courts basically specifically said the FDA is not a doctor. It needs to stick to the facts. And if you understand anything about our modern culture and what impacts the way people think about topics, simply giving the facts or tables or figures is not going to carry the day. And the competition is at it 24/7 with the kind of emotive displays that cause people to change their views. So I'd say the misinformation team won significantly. The government lost significantly overall on behalf of the public. And I think that's still continuing today. And, I'll be glad to talk more about my current activities in this regard. But the FDA is, so the point is the FDA itself is pretty constrained. Putting out press releases and labels on products, competing with a 24/7 stream of social media, that's not much of a contest.
So let's bring it up to date a little bit of what's going on in the FDA. The new administration brought really significant changes to the FDA, including firing 3,500 or 25% of the employees. How's this going to affect the mission of the FDA? And stop and put it in dollars and cents signs. $1 in $5 that we spend is somehow regulated by the FDA. That's enormous responsibility to the public. And so, what's the FDA going to do going forward?
Well, I don't know. And I guess I was somewhat famously quoted. I was on a plane when the firing started, and I was hooked up to the internet on the plane, and my social media exploded with messages from old friends that this was happening, and it was so massive that I just put out a thing on LinkedIn and Blue Sky that said the FDA as we've known it is finished. And I think that is the case. So you can't run an organization with 25% of the workforce no longer present. And of course, the way this happened with Doge, Um, this is, I'm not breaking any news here. I've been very outspoken about this. I am a fan of AI, and I have personally had to oversee multiple reductions in force. Remembering, Toby, as you well know, I used to run a thing called the Duke Clinical Research Institute that did large clinical trials, which run on contracts. And you go through these phases where, I mean, an example that people don't normally think of, you're in the middle of a big clinical trial and it's great. The treatment saves lives. The trial is stopped. Now you've got hundreds of people with no work to do and no way to pay them. So I'm not one who says you should never do a reduction in force. But the way this was done was really crude. It was called AI, but it was really not what I would think of as modern AI. And people were let go for reasons that are inexplicable based on emails from anonymous sources that basically had lies in them about people's performance. And so it's bad enough that you're losing key people with no plan for exactly why it's being done and what the effect will be. But the impact that has on the other people who are working in the organization is profound. Now, this all happened before the current commissioner came in. It sort of was in midstream, and but the impact has been substantial. So the analogy that I've been widely promoting since that day really is Humpty Dumpty. I'm sure you guys are old men, but I'm sure you remember all the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't put Humpty Dumpty back together again was the verse we learned in nursery school. But there is a 5-verse version where in the end Humpty Dumpty is put back together again. And so I don't think the question is, will the FDA go back to the way it was at any point? And I don't think the current lack of workforce and instability at the FDA is tenable in the long run. So something new and different is going to need to be created. And so, I'm urging people who have an interest to get involved in planning for what should the FDA of the future look like.
You think this is on the same note? Is this going to slow down approvals?
Well, I think of it less as slowing down approvals. I think because of the way the user fees work, where the payments are based on meeting metrics, I expect that there'll be an effort to come close to meeting the timelines that are in the metrics. But as I think both of you know, developing a medical product is not a matter of submitting an application and having the bureaucracy look at it. 95% of the time is actually before that. When you're going through the iterative process of developing the product, typically through involving a series of meetings with the FDA and communications to keep things on track, remembering that the FDA is seeing what all the competitors are doing.
Mm-hmm.
And the competitors, of course, they're not going to tell you what they're doing, and the FDA cannot reveal specifics that are trade secrets. But if you're going off course, it can tell you, wait a minute, guys, you need to think about your research design here, and here's what you need to be considering. But if you don't have enough staff, you can't do the meetings. And if your experienced people have left, the advice that you're giving companies is going to be less good. And that will slow things down. I have no, I'll be shocked if that doesn't happen. Now, Toby, you've also worked at Google.
Mm-hmm.
And I like to say I worked with 3 Nobel Prize winners at Google. I didn't work directly with them, but they got Nobel Prizes and I got to see what was going on. There's a lot of faith in that somehow AI is going to make all this easy. And I don't believe that's the case at all. I think AI can make it better if it's done well. And it can relieve the staff at FDA of mind-numbing tasks that take up a lot of their time. But medical product development is complicated, and there's a lot of human judgment involved. And much like clinical care, where I don't think AI should be replacing clinicians. It should just enable them to do what they should have been doing all along if the system worked. I think the same is true at FDA. So I don't see the person shortages as being fixed by AI either. It's going to take a different configuration. And in the meanwhile, I think the problems will be upstream, not so much did a application get reviewed.
There have been about 1,000 AI-enabled devices that have been approved under the heading of software as a medical device. And what do you think the FDA's role should be in regulating AI for clinical decision support?
Well, for about a decade, I've been saying the way this will go is AI will take off as it should. No one knows exactly how to regulate it, so there'll be a lot of freedom to operate. Some bad things will happen, and then regulation will kick in a major way. And when you talk about the 1,000 AI applications and devices, those are mostly AI and imaging devices, really, that are doing things that machine learning, we probably all agree, is made to do. Some of them are more or less really sophisticated AI. But as we get into generative AI and clinical decision support, it's a whole new ball game where I think the guidance that exists so far is pretty good. And it basically says, here are a set of things that you need to be considering. For the most part, if it's decision support, there's going to be enforcement discretion that is not heavily regulated. If you're sticking AI in a device which has a vital function like a defibrillator, that's different. It's going to be regulated as part of the device and have to meet stringent criteria. But the area of decision support is so vast, there's no way the FDA could possibly hire enough people to regulate it the old-fashioned way. And what we're going to need, and the analogy that I've used is more like the food system that we have in the U.S., and which I was not an expert in. I'm still not, but I learned a heck of a lot during my time at FDA. And remember that farms and eating establishments only get inspected by FDA every 3 to 5 years. But in between, there are a set of 10 foundational rules called the Food Safety Modernization Act rules that everyone is expected to abide by. And they're principles. They're not detailed specifications of exactly what you do. And so, and it involves collaboration between farms, distribution systems, county, states, and the federal system, all working together. And by and large, it's pretty darn effective. Now, it's not perfect, but the ecosystem self-regulates. There's simple things like if you got a farm upstream where there are cows, you need to have special controls for your lettuce to make sure the cow dookie is not getting on the lettuce. And I think when it comes to AI, there are some foundational principles which are rapidly evolving, and the ecosystem really has to work. And the last thing I'll say, I think the really important player in the ecosystem is going to be health systems themselves. So you're both health system people. In order to validate an AI algorithm, particularly one which is using advanced AI in place, adapting to the environment, it has to be validated in the place and system where it's being used. This is called local recurrent validation. And that means that health systems are going to have to develop this capability. The vendors can't do it because they don't have the data. The health systems have the data. And health systems got to get their act together to be capable of doing this. Then what I would see is a system like the farms where it runs, and periodically the FDA checks in, and if something goes wrong, the government swoops in. But you can't regulate this the way you do regulate traditional drugs and devices. I hope that's helpful as a concept. We'll see how it all plays out.
So what's the biggest challenge now for the FDA going forward? I mean, you've got AI coming in. Is it gonna require a whole new set of regulators to begin to set those principles for the FDA?
I think we had a really good core of people there before. There's been turnover, but I think there are plenty of people who can step into that role. I think the biggest challenge for the FDA overall is the Humpty Dumpty problem. All this stuff is interrelated. There's a common set of laws, and while this is a lot like a medical center in a way. I mean, you have departments of surgery and medicine and pediatrics. They need to have their own loyalties and training, et cetera, but there's an infrastructure which is common for healthcare delivery. In the same way, FDA regulation has a lot of commonality across the different commodities that are regulated, but also has special needs. And that's going to have to be reconfigured in this new era. I regard AI as just like a part of the environment which is going to be pervasive, much like it already is in our everyday lives. You don't think about AI when you drive your car these days, but you sure are dependent on it. Most of us can't even use a map now to figure out where we're going. And I think regulation and healthcare delivery will be the same way. So I think the problems are still mostly human. It's, most people always try to do the right thing. All of us have failures along the way. But in everything we do, there are some bad players who will try to take advantage of the system where you need regulators. And how to do that effectively is going to have to change with the environment and adapt to these political pressures, which are pervasive right now.
How do you think the FDA should, or can restore public trust after this period of controversy and low morale within the organization?
Well, I always love to point out that when I left, we were second only to NASA in terms of internal morale at the FDA. There's an annual government survey of all the employees, and I've been in every kind of organization now, of course, from Google to academic medical centers and biotech companies and device companies. So morale was really good, and it is low right now. And it's of note that they decided not to run the survey. This is not an FDA decision. It was a government-wide decision. I think there are reasons for that. You kind of know what it's likely to show. The public trust, I regard, as a whole different issue. And I don't think the FDA can solve the public trust issue on its own. All of our societal institutions are in trouble right now from the view of the public, including, by the way, our organized health systems, which have plummeted in terms of confidence. But at the same time, people have a pretty high level of confidence in their doctors, nurses, pharmacists that they interact with on a daily basis. And so this gets to where I'm focused right now, which is I hope we'll develop a systematic approach within our health sciences systems, particularly the academic ones, where we begin to build trust from the bottom up. I actually believe that we've lost a lot of the connection between the primary care system, that is, the people that patients interact with the most, the pharmacists, nurses, docs out there that they see frequently, and the healthcare leadership and establishment. And that's where we got to really focus our energy, because if you just take the FDA as an example, even at its peak, there are only 100 or so people that are dealing with communication with the public. It's 320 million people. And so the idea that given the court constraints, the FDA is going to radically revamp public communication doesn't make sense. But what the FDA could do is communicate together with other federal agencies much better, and hopefully with the help of leadership of health systems, much better with the practicing community. I mean, you think the public is disconcerted. Look at the morale of people who are trying to practice medicine today. The moral injury is profound. because people know that they're not doing what they were trained to do at the level they need to because of the system they're working in. So I'm hopeful that we'll reconstitute this from the ground up, and that the many clinicians that people interact with will carry that message that builds confidence. We have a little organization we call Aletheia. That's the Greek goddess for truth, that I hope will be a groundswell movement of medical students and pharmacists and nurses, but also postdocs. Because you talk a group that's threatened right now in terms of all this training to become biomedical scientists, and the rug's been pulled out from under them in terms of NIH funding, and even aspersions for those who go into industry that it's evil what they're doing, which I don't believe is true at all.
So Rob, two questions. First of all, how badly underfunded do you think the FDA is?
I think the FDA has always been underfunded if you look at its mandate. And I think one way to think about this is if you look at the user fees from the 5 or 6 areas where user fees are collected, there's a very rational process that went on. And I always have to say, constitutionally, I'm not in favor of user fees. I wish that taxes paid for the FDA. It's a public service. But user fees exist, and I learned a lot by working with them, because there's a very rational process. The industries want their products reviewed and regulated on a timeline, and that's much like running a business at the FDA. You have to meet the timeline. You agree on time and materials, and that's the cost, and that creates a budget. If you look at that, the drug and device parts of the FDA have grown considerably in its budget because of the user fees, and that's an agreement certified by Congress, but an agreement between the FDA and the industry on what those costs should be. The food side of the FDA, where it's purely tax money, has inflation adjusted not grown at all over the last 25 years. And that's a real problem. But just look now at what's being discussed about food additives as an example. If we went to a system where they were really reviewed and generally recognized as safe, as a concept is no longer in play. For those of you who don't follow this, GRAS are generally recognized as safe as a process by which a company can add something to the food supply and certify itself that it's safe based on scientific evaluation done by other people. But if the FDA had to do all that work, it would take an enormous workforce. So we got to solve these things. It's pretty massively underfunded. And one of the most difficult jobs of the FDA leadership has always been triaging what's most important to deal with out of all the things that are suboptimal.
Yeah.
One you wouldn't think of much, Toby, is enforcement and the use of lawyers. We have a country where if you are importing something that's illegal and we try to seize it as a government activity, you have a right to a jury trial, a court trial. That means the FDA's got to devote a whole ton of lawyers to every single one of those cases, but there are only a certain number of lawyers that you can hire. And so there's always a constant triage of what's going to get the priority.
Finally, let me ask you, do you think we're going to see more stringent or more lenient regulations from the FDA as we go forward? And how's that going to affect medical device companies?
Well, I think the FDA is always in a Goldilocks position, not too big, not too small, and it's different for every commodity. And I think devices themselves, as you know, they're just tremendously complex. And in some cases, it's very simple. So bed rails and hospital gowns are devices. You don't need a lot of regulation there, although some is needed. People do fall out of bed, and that can be catastrophic. But decision support AI inserted into an implantable device for a life-threatening disease, that requires stringent regulation, which I think will get more stringent, but focused on where it's important if we do this right. So I guess I don't think there's a single answer to that. And I'll reiterate, one of my greatest hopes is that the ecosystem will become more accountable, because in cases where the ecosystem's doing a great job, the FDA can do less. And I think that's always something to look for. But you know the history that when regulation is loosened up and something bad happens, then there tends to be an overreaction by the government, and it oscillates back and forth. So it's always trying to find that sweet spot. Or as we like to say, as we said during my time at the FDA, if both sides are pissed off in an FDA decision, you found the right spot.
Rob, listen, thank you very much for doing this, and particularly thank you for your service through the FDA. I know that you've been a tremendous contributor for a long time.
Thank you, guys, and y'all take care.
You too. We want to thank you very much for spending time with us today, and especially in this current environment. You have such a unique perspective, and we are grateful to you for being able to share this with us today. So thank you. And thank our audience also for joining. And a recording of the presentation will be available on our LinkedIn page as always, and in the library section of our website. Be well. Thank you, Rob.